It happened to be full of bitey insects this morning, so I'm not going outside. So yeah, we've got kicked this off again after a bit of a hiatus where we keep getting our thoughts together on how best to proceed. But I think we're in a position now where we know what we're doing, and we really want this as a community engagement. And so we want as much feedback from yourselves as possible, and also as much interaction with it as well. So if anyone out there is interested in giving us a webinar, interested in raising points, please get in touch with Sitlari and colleagues from UKCP. Today we have two speakers, Susanne Lorenz and Peter Walton. And just by way, I've been asked, my name's David Viner, as it says on the screen. I'm the independent chair of the UK Climate Programmes Development and Knowledge Network. Therefore, what I say are my views and not the views of the Met Office or the UK government or any other official body. They're just my views and opinions and comments on the science, and maybe a few other little things associated with it when I slip into that. However, let's just kick on straight away with Susanne. We have a 15-20 minute presentation. We'll follow by a Q&A. So please post your questions in the Q&A box on Teams, and everyone is going to be muted throughout unless they really express an interest to speak. The webinar is recorded, and that will all be shared on the Met Office's YouTube channel, probably mixed in with the weather forecasts and other things. Any technical difficulties, don't ask me. I won't have a clue, but there's an email there where you can get in touch with the UKCP technical people. Okay, so let's kick off straight away with Susanne. Susanne is from the University of Leeds. We're talking about the use and usability of local authority climate service in climate data in local authorities. Susanne is a lecturer in climate change adaptation at the Sustainability Research Institute at Leeds, and has been working in the field of climate change adaptation for some 15 years. Prior to the university, she worked in the local government sector and the environmental consultancy business on climate risk, resilience and adaptation. So without any more me blabbing away, off to you, Susanne.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar series. Let's see whether I can get the technology to work. So I think I can now move the slides. So just to say, whilst it's me speaking, and obviously you've got Pete talking next, but Pete's also been an integral part of this project that we've been doing, as well as Taylor Davenport and Lan Yang. So just to say, it's not just my insights that you get to hear here. So just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. I'll tell you a little bit about the project that we did, how it kind of links to UKCP 18 data, because that's obviously why you're all here and what you're interested in. I'll tell you a bit about the participants that took part in our project, and particularly then look at how they've engaged with the Local Authority Climate Service, so LUCS, that's the acronym you'll hear a lot. And then I'll tell you some insights that we've taken from the participants and developed some use cases of how the LUCS is being used by local and combined authorities, and how these map onto the adaptation cycle. So that's getting started, climate change risks and vulnerabilities, adaptation options. And then I'll close by giving a little bit of an insight on the user feedback on the LUCS so far, what they like and what they would like to see more of, and then kind of brief discussion points and some possible next steps. So we've been working with the Met Office on a project that lasted from October 2024 to March 25. So it's only a 6-month project, and it started in line, with the Met Office launching the new Local Authority Climate Service. So this is a free online tool, essentially, that whilst developed for local authorities, anyone can really access. And even I'd say if you're not an expert in climate projections, it's very simple, within a matter of a few clicks, to essentially generate a report for a locality in the UK that you're interested in. And then you get a very nice, it's about 8-page report on essentially that digests the climate projections that we have through UKCP 18, but also places them in a wider context of what does it mean and how that influences climate risk assessments. So what it's meant to do is essentially to provide really ready to use and accessible data for local authorities or for a local area, then create this kind of very handy to and easy to use and disseminate climate report, and therefore then also kind of help people actually have some more user-friendly and helpful resources for adaptation planning. And so the Met Office came to us and asked us to essentially try and understand a little bit how local authorities are engaging with this tool and how they're using it to help them with their adaptation journey. So that's what we set out to do. And just a couple of screenshots here to kind of help visualize a little bit what it means here with UKCP 18 data. So obviously users in the UK have long been able to access UKCP 18 data through the user interface, but I guess that's also quite an involved process and requires quite a well-informed user. So this report essentially then digests all of that quite complex information that you can delve into through the user interface and provides tables and kind of icons like this that you can see here that sort of very quickly then summarizes UKCP 18 data in the report. So we actually conducted quite a number of interviews, so 22 in total, with local and combined authorities between December and March, and had quite a good geographical coverage. So you can see on the map on the left, we had quite a lot of representation, especially from the Northeast, Yorkshire and the Humber, but also from the West Midlands. And then a bit more varied spread. As you can see, we have had some areas that we haven't been able to recruit anyone to talk to us, but I guess ultimately we weren't trying to set out to have a really representative insight, but rather try and understand a little bit the variability of use across the UK. And we managed to get quite a few different types of local and combined authorities. So we had some metropolitan boroughs, but we also had some combined authorities, and we had some London boroughs and some unitary authorities. So at least we can kind of say it's a spread of insights that we get from different types of authorities. So I guess in terms of initially, we sort of asked them, you know, how and are you engaging with the LUX? And what we found there is that essentially people are saying, yes, we are. So we tend to download this report because it's so easy. And then there's quite a lot of dissemination of the report, and people have said they really like the sort of tables, very easily accessible formats, but they also really like the sort of impact icons and the very short summaries of the impacts. There is a whole part of the website that allows you to access the data through a GIS platform. And when we talk to people, that wasn't being engaged with that much yet. But I should caveat this by saying the LUX was only launched in October, and obviously our project started at the same time. So this may well also be an area that kind of expands as people kind of become more aware of the capabilities and availabilities through the LUX. And so the main part really, so whilst we collected all of this feedback actually on the LUX and fed that back to the Met Office, and the Met Office fed that back to DEFRA and is using that already in trying to kind of understand how to improve the next iteration of the LUX and kind of with that user feedback in mind. The main area of interest for us was to try and understand and develop some actual case studies, with the aim here being to say, well, actually, for a lot of local authorities and actors and users, it might be a lot easier to kind of see, okay, here's a range of examples of what's being done. I can do the same in my organization. So that's what we tried to do. So after kind of our first round of interviews, we did another set of interviews to have these deep dives into more specific use cases. And we had a lot of discussions on how best to then structure that information, but in the end came to format it in this way, where we've mapped it onto the adaptation cycle. That's quite familiar, I guess, to this community. And we found that at the point where we were conducting these interviews, the use was mainly on the first half of the cycle. So on getting started with adaptation, on understanding your climate change risks and vulnerabilities, and a little bit on identifying adaptation options. We didn't find any evidence in our interviews on it being used for assessing and implementing adaptation options or monitoring and evaluating them. That's not to say that it cannot be used like that, but it's just that's not where our participants were using it. And we've just put some of the local and combined authorities that helped us develop the case study. So a big thank you to them as well. So this is quite small. I appreciate that. Just wanted to show this. We will be highlighting the findings at next week's Exeter Climate Forum, and just wanted to kind of put this more as a visual impact rather than for you to be able to read all the detail, but to sort of highlight how we've mapped this onto the cycle. And we've had a lot of help here from a brilliant student of ours who's designed this in this way. So you can also see here through the sort of bigger red and orange and kind of light blue where the emphasis of our data is, but I'll take you through that in more detail in the next slides. So I won't kind of dwell on all of the information that we've gathered, but just wanted to highlight some of the very interesting overarching strands of use that we found. So the LACS, and therefore also, I guess, the UKCP 18 data that's kind of digested through the LACS is being used particularly to try and get more senior management buy-in, excuse me, but also kind of to raise awareness, well, with senior colleagues, but also just with other colleagues that might sit in other local authority services. It's also actually interestingly being used for kind of wider community engagement on adaptation, as well as being included in actual climate literacy training. And so we've got a sort of range of examples on the side where you can kind of see, it's being included in, for example, papers that are being prepared within organizations on trying to understand where they're at in terms of adaptation. But it's also really specifically used, for example, with climate and emergency planning and business continuity planning, where they're kind of looking at, how does what we do actually link to the climate risk information that can be gleaned from the LACS. So there's a whole host of different types of things, and it'll be really exciting to see what the climate adaptation e-learning resource will look like, which was in development when we were conducting the interviews, and that included a lot of the information directly from the LACS. The second case study was then looking at that next bit of the cycle, so understanding climate change risks and vulnerabilities. And what we see here is that it's quite common and a common process in local and combined authorities to undertake and undergo climate change risk and vulnerability assessments. And for that, the LACS is being perceived as extremely valuable. And we sort of found that actually a lot of the people we talked to are very well versed with using UK climate risk indicators and the UKCP 18 user interface, but have just found that accessing UKCP 18 data through the LACS is just a much quicker process. And very interestingly, also, they've sort of said, actually, it makes it much easier for them to justify the science that sits underneath the climate change risk assessments, because it has sort of Met Office branding on it. So they don't necessarily feel that they have to do that convincing work, because they can say, here's just a trusted source of information in a trusted organization in the UK. And very quickly can they use that as the foundation for their risk assessments. And the other interesting aspect, and I think Pete will talk about this a little bit in his talk as well, is what we've seen is that the request for the use of LACS is also being integrated into tenders that go out from combined and local authorities to the wider consultancy sector. So where actually is being said, if you are undertaking climate change risk and vulnerability assessments for us, we are asking you to use the LACS to help us do that. So that's a kind of interesting space where that information is then also now kind of being used and asked to be used by the private consulting sector. And then lastly, what we found really interesting as well in the sort of third case study is that the LACS is also being used to help local authorities identify adaptation options. And what was particularly interesting here is one of the local authorities we spoke to actually had been one of the authorities that had participated in the DEFRA adaptation reporting power pilot with local authorities. So this is where DEFRA has trialed very similar reporting, I guess, in style to what's being done generally through the ARP process every 5 years across the UK. And that local authority has very specifically used information and copied information, as they should have done or could have done very easily, from the LACS into their ARP report that went to DEFRA. But also, interestingly, we see it's being included in climate action plans, as well as being communicated to regional audit committees. So through all of these case studies, we've actually seen a huge variety of use cases, and the Met Office is currently finalising the case studies, and they will be published freely accessible online to hopefully kind of showcase how different authorities can quite easily, hopefully, pick this up and kind of run with it in their own organisations. Like I said, we collected quite a lot of user feedback, which was extremely positive. I've kind of put it on there. We fed this into the next iteration of LUX. And I think what's particularly interesting here is this question of, it's very easy to further communicate the information that we get through UKCP 18. So a lot of the officers we speak to ultimately are sort of further conduits for communicating climate science and galvanizing adaptation actions, and they found that the LUX is really helpful, or is really helping them to do that. And they've also kind of communicated that it helps to kind of build collaboration and support within the organization, but also through that wider community engagement. So in that sense, it's been particularly interesting to see how that information that is being provided directly translates into kind of applied action. So obviously, when you talk to people and ask them about, what do you think, there's a lot of suggestions for improvement that have come through. And I think while some of them might be quite specific to the LUX, and I've kind of put them on here in terms of the scale at which climate information is being made available, and whether it might be useful to have these, for example, at kind of lower output areas rather than just at the sort of local and combined authority scale. There was a bigger conversation around what else would be really helpful for local and combined authority actors to have made available to them through the LUX. And a lot of that was around kind of understanding extreme events better, and kind of also trying to understand how that links to past extreme events in their locality. So to help, I guess, with that conversation of tapping into lived experience of past extreme events, and how that can help us then plan and build on that experience for future extreme events, but also then just more complicated questions, for example, around cascading and compound events and what information we have on that and can be made available. And then very importantly, and there's a question mark here whether that's out of scope for the LUX, is around really how that then translates into processes, adaptation planning processes within those authorities. So what additional guidance can be made available, what kind of training, what sort of workshops, understanding where additional expertise might be needed, or where this kind of feeds straight into kind of local risk matrices and business continuity processes. So there's a much bigger conversation to be had, and is ongoing, of course, of how we support adaptation planning within those kind of organizations that goes beyond kind of providing information. And so just a few reflections at the end. I think I might have 1 or 2 minutes left, but it's been very interesting to kind of see that we've had a lot of positive feedback, and there's been no negative feedback. It's just been kind of suggestions on further improvements, which have shown like a really great sense of engagement with the tool and a great uptake of the tool. And so we do think there'll be more use of the LUX being made in the coming months. And many of us have said to us, it'll be great if you can talk to us again in 6 or 12 months' time, because we'll be further along on the journey then. I think the nice thing of this particular project as well is to kind of be able to say that to the users that we've talked to, actually your feedback and your voice has already been fed back into the kind of conversations that are happening within the Met Office and with DEFRA on how to improve the next version. And then I think there is just that kind of broader question on, I suppose, the scope of LUX and what is the role of LUX, and I guess also what's the role of this community and sort of providing information, moving from providing information to kind of providing and supporting decision making and adaptation planning. And then lastly, I think some of the broader observations that we've had through the conversations with the local authorities, because naturally a conversation about using climate information and adaptation planning sits very clearly within, how does that process work within your local authority, and what barriers and enablers are you experiencing? There's a very clear conversation that we ought to have as a community around how do we kind of help with a greater sense of collaboration to help use climate information and climate evidence for climate risk assessments, and how do we actually support the sort of decision making and adaptation planning that goes beyond the next kind of 5 years. So yeah, I think the other interesting thing to watch out for is a question around, we had one case where the LUCs was going to be used for developing adaptation pathways. That was just at the outset of their project. So I think it'd be really interesting to understand how that unfolds and how that learning can be applied across the wider sector. And then I think Pete will talk a little bit about this in the next presentation, is very much around actually how this tool that was developed with local authorities in mind is and can be used actually by other local and non-local actors. So yeah, that was kind of a whistle-stop tour of our project. I think I can take some questions now, if anyone's got any.
Yeah, here you go, Susanne. I'll take some of these off the Q&A, and apologies if I don't get around to asking all that. The first one, I think is Mark. I think Mark Humphreys. I haven't got the full name on my chat thing. Do you think, maybe not a question for you, Susanne, but I think it's one to think about for everyone. Do you think 1.5 is in the past? Should we report in those terms? What difference do you see amongst users from this versus how they interact with it amongst many? I think when we look at 1.5, I think it is the present situation. It's looking at the science where we are, but we've breached it. We've hit the global temperature of 1.5. That's the mean. That's the middle of any 30-year period. So I think we're in that period now where we've gone above what we expect. So it's difficult for many users, I think, to understand what that actually means when it comes down to their local situation. I don't know if you, Susanne, have got anything else to comment on that.
I mean, it's a question that often comes up, whether, and that's also linked to, which, if local authorities are using RCPs, which RCP to use, and is RCP 2.6 still to be used or not. I think it'd be really useful, I think, if as a community we could provide some clearer guidance and some clearer expertise on what we think as a science community should be used and where we're at, because I think that confusion or that uncertainty is quite widespread, and I think it's quite tricky then for local authorities to know what to plan for as well. And it links to the question of which global warming level they should be planning for, and what guidance we should give, and should you plan for the worst case, and is that sensible with limited resource? So I think there's quite a lot of nuance there that is quite tricky to communicate often.
And just finally, you mentioned, this is from Simon Hawkins, you mentioned use by LA in supporting their ARP4 submissions. Have you had any feedback from DEFRA on what worked well or needs more focus, as ARP was a pilot for local authorities? How would this be fed into the development of the LACs?
Yeah, so we, whilst we presented the findings to DEFRA, we weren't necessarily involved in the actual DEFRA pilot project. One of the local authorities that we interviewed said they retrospectively obviously got some feedback from DEFRA on how they'd undertaken their risk assessment and done their initial report, which I think they found quite helpful, but they haven't, shared the detail of that feedback with us. So I don't know, Pete, did you want to add anything to that? I don't think we had any insight on that.
No. I mean, it's as simple as that. I think I don't know how far they've got with doing the assessment and collating all the feedback yet, but it would certainly be interesting to get sight of it in light of the conversations that we were having during this project.
Okay, look, I'll have to bring that to an end now as we move on to Peter Walton's talk. But Susanne, if you can take time to look at any of the Q&A, the questions I've been asked, and answer those whilst you're not listening to Peter, because you'll be doing the questions, that'd be fantastic. And there's a note about slides as well. The slides aren't generally made available because they're incorporated in the video on the Met Office's YouTube channel. Okay, so next of all, I'd like to introduce Peter Walton from the University of Leeds as well. We're looking at exploring purveyor engagement within the UK climate projections. Peter's an impact translation fellow at the University of Leeds, where he's responsible for developing and supporting policy and businesses in the use of climate information. Peter combines both climate change and education, allowing him to communicate the practical implications of climate impacts to a wide range of audiences. And his research examines stakeholder engagements with climate change adaptation science. What strikes me about education is, after being involved in this for 30 odd years, people still need educating about the basics, which is always a challenge. Yeah, even people who've been around as long as me in different sectors, whether in business, local authorities or whatever, still don't fully understand something quite simple as the greenhouse effect. So it's always a challenge, and there's always going to be a need for that. You might spend a bit of time at the next Reform Party conference, Peter. A few people early might be there chatting to you. But anyway, fire away, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying that. Anyway, fire away.
David, thanks very much for that introduction, and to the community for inviting me to present on behalf of, as with the previous talk, the team that were involved with this project. Can I just check that the slides you can see clearly? I've taken control, so hopefully what you can see are the relevant slides. I've got a thumbs up from someone. Thank you, whoever that was. I appreciate it. So yes, so what I want to do is to report on a project that was running at roughly the same time as the project that Susie just reported on, the LAX report, which was building on let me advance this. Oh, I would advance the slide, but there we go. It's building on a set of understanding that the Met Office are undergoing and have been for a little while now, about how the UK climate projections are being used, where are the opportunities for further development, who's using them, how are they using them, etc. So this is very much building on some excellent work that was done previously. I see Neha Mittal from the Met Office is on the call. So hopefully, if there are any other technical questions about this broader assessment, she might want to chip in and support with answering the questions. That obviously I'll be able to talk specifically about the findings from this particular project itself. So what we aim to achieve, as you can see on this particular slide, is to get a better understanding about UK climate projections, but with the broader consideration around UK climate services and who's offering these services within the UK. And the Met Office suggested we explore a specific area of this climate service provision through the label or through the sector of purveyors. Now, what's understood by purveyors was typically about who's using the climate projections in order to provide a service to a client, a customer, a stakeholder, etc. But what we wanted to do, or rather what the Met Office wanted us to do, was to explore beyond just who's offering it in terms of a financial service, but thinking about other organisations, and typically they've been called boundary organisations in the past as well, who are taking climate information, UK climate projections, but other data and other information as well, working with an organisation, a client, a stakeholder, a customer, assimilating all that knowledge and supporting them in a decision-making context. So adding value to the UK climate projections as they stand alone. As you can see from the timelines, I mentioned it was running in conjunction with the LAX project, and it was interesting having those the two projects running concurrently, because there was a lot of interesting conversations that were going on that reflected interest from both sides, as Susie's already mentioned, in terms of who's using these resources, how are they using it. Local authorities were a big client community of a lot of these purveyor organizations. The initial part of the project, we did a quick desktop assessment of just who's in the sector, who's operating. The Met Office, through an initial survey, identified about 80 organisations that identified themselves as purveyors. We found over 200. So there was about nearly 300 organizations which are operating in this field, considering broadly environmental change, but obviously within that climate is a significant factor. What we don't know is whether all those purveyors were actually using the climate projections or not, but certainly they'll be drawing on projections or certainly climate information of some kind. So if they're not already using the projections, we could anticipate that they may well be using them in the future. And perhaps if they're not using it, well, maybe there's a way that we can actually develop the projections so that they can use it. And we can reflect on that a little bit more when I present some of the findings. Based on that initial desktop survey, we then reached out to as many as we could, and we were fortunate enough to speak to just over 31 purveyor organisations were finally interviewed. Within those organisations, there may be several people within the organisation who actually participated in the interview. Sometimes it was just one. So again, whilst we weren't able to capture the whole organisation's use of the climate projections, we certainly got a valuable insight. And then the final part of the project in February and March was carrying out the analysis of the interviews and then reporting to DEFRA and the Met Office. So we were able to reach across a wide range of sectors. As you can see there, local government were one of the big client communities. Cross-sector purveyors were operating not just necessarily within one particular sector, such as infrastructure or agriculture or defence. And I think, again, looking at the landscape of climate services and climate service providers, recognising that this diversity within a single organisation, and so the diversity of their needs of data sources such as the climate projections needs to be recognised. That it's not just one use for one particular client in one organisation. And we were able to speak to a range of organisations in terms of size, from some sole traders, single consultants sitting on their own, through to some big global multinationals who had interests within the UK. So following the analysis, so following the interviews and then following the analysis, we were able to come up with some of these sort of key messages, which is what I want to focus on for the rest of this particular presentation. Obviously, they capture some very broad messages, and there's a lot to unpack under each one, and I'll do my best in the limited time that we've got. But if anybody has any particular questions, we'll obviously have an opportunity today to answer them, but be more than happy to discuss these in more detail at another opportunity if anybody would like to reach out and discuss these. So in terms of what the projections mean to this community within the climate service landscape within the UK, I think it's really important to say that the Met Office and the climate projections themselves are seen as hugely credible. Where there were opportunities to use other data sources such as CMIP or the Cordex suites, if it was appropriate, clients insisted that the UK climate projections were used, and they deferred to the Met Office guidance and understanding of how to use them. And so what we can take from that is that the projections are playing a central role within the climate service provision within the UK. What was also coming through, as we sort of saw through the LACS presentation, was that there are plenty of opportunities to develop aspects of the projections. We asked them, what areas would you like to see developed? There was a whole raft which we have passed on, but it was included things like increase in number of variables. So wind was one of the variables which people wanted to know more about: wind speed, wind direction, gusts, etc. They're very interested in trying to understand combined events. So if you're going to have wind and say snow events, what could you look at those combinations? Because obviously in terms of the type of impact, it would be very different from having one single variable. Another aspect that people were asking for, and this came through from the LAX project as well, was this idea about downscaling. That there was this perception that if you could downscale the projections to the finer the resolution, the better, the decision making was going to be that much more robust. However, speaking to some of the other people with purveyors within the that were being interviewed, they were very much against that, recognizing that there's a whole heap of trouble and assumptions brought into downscaling, which aren't necessarily then translated to the client, to the customer, around the statistical processes, levels of certainty, etc. So whilst we can pass on that there are these developments that are required, there was a note of caution about how they should be used. And again, this comes back to some of the questions I'm going to pick up on in a minute. And that's regarding, well, how is this information used? How is it governed? Should it be governed so that we're making sure that it's used appropriately and so that the most robust decisions can be made? As Susie identified, there was a huge demand for increase in the amount of guidance. Not necessarily the quality, what they saw, they really liked, but actually there needed to be more. And it didn't matter whether they were very sophisticated users of projections or whether they were relative newcomers. At all levels, they saw that there was a great need for guidance and support. Again, making sure that the projections were used appropriately. One of the really interesting factors, and I guess it doesn't come as any surprise in the world that we live in today, is that people don't have much time. Even these big multinational organizations, when they get a project, they need to do the study, do the analysis, write the report, get it out the door as quickly as possible. So what they need is quick, reliable, and easy to access data. Currently, UKCP 18, there are issues to do with the user interface, might be a bit clunky, might not necessarily be intuitive. So a lot of people are now just going to the data store and mining the data, drawing it down, running it through their own models, rather than trying to rely on the facilities that are currently provided. But what they are also doing, and this speaks to a point that Susie mentioned in her presentation, is that actually they're looking for new ways to access data, which is quick and reliable. So tools such as the LAX tool that we've just heard about, tools such as the UK Climate Risk Indicators that was developed by the University of, or project led by the University of Reading, are becoming increasingly used because they provide the data in a way that's easily embedded within the decision-making context. Variables are understood in the form of hazards and impacts, and therefore are more readily used. And they're more easily understood because of the way that they've been processed and presented. So there may be a way, if we're thinking about how we're developing the climate projections, to think along those sorts of lines. That it's not just a question of presenting more and more raw data, but actually how that data is presented, processed, either within organisations such as the Met Office, or more broadly, such as through projects that the UK Climate Risk Indicators performed. Again, thinking about this sort of next generation of climate projections, one of the other points they wanted to put across was that actually maybe there's a new mode that we could consider rather than having the big launch UKCP 09, UKCP 18, and obviously the iterations we had previous to that, maybe it's more appropriate to have smaller iterations where new variables are introduced, where maybe new time slices are introduced, where maybe new resolutions on spatial scales are introduced, and to work on that. This would help also get over the issue of it being very difficult to leap from, as some were referring to, going from UKCP 09 to UKCP 18, that there were issues to do with the decision of the models that were being run, and they were having to run two sets of models concurrently until they knew that the decisions that were being based on 09 transitioned smoothly across to UKCP 18. So there may be a way that we consider how projections are launched within the UK. Then the final point that I just want to put across, or get across rather, is this issue about the broader UK climate service landscape with which they're operating in. And again, this comes back to how the UK climate projections are being used, because there's a strong role for regulatory authorities. At the moment, within certain sectors, it's very disjointed. The advice, the way that the projections are being asked to be used, the type of scenarios, timeframes, etc., differs. So actually, because they're regulatory authorities, because organisations need to adhere to what it is that they're saying, how these regulatory authorities are talking about the climate projections and how they're used could have a significant impact on the decision-making process within UK, within those specific sectors. Maybe there's a way of broadening out those regulatory authorities beyond some of the utilities that we're familiar with. So ultimately, what we can begin thinking about is my final point, that actually there's maybe a new model for climate service delivery, recognizing the growth of this sector, this purveyor sector, moving beyond just consultants, but there's huge. We found nearly 300. That was a simple survey. I'm sure if we did a more in-depth analysis, we would find even more. And the chances are that in coming years, that number is going to grow even larger. Therefore, we might want to consider how projections, how data is provided. Is it provided for free? Recognizing that we've got the UK PLC to support, but what's the role of, say, climate projections, such as this sort of huge free resource? What might that play within this broader climate service delivery? So on that particular point, that was a quick summary of what we were able to identify within this particular project. As I said, I'm more than happy to take questions now, or if anybody would like to talk about this offline, be more than happy to carry on that conversation, as I'm sure Susie will be for the LAX project as well. But thank you very much.
Peter, thanks very much. I'm not sure, I'm just checking my, need to make sure it's not having any problems with the chat, but anyway, on the Q&A, I've not picked up any yet. But just it's more of a comment on the final point you made about the regulation of climate services. There's been a rapid increase in the number of third-party commercial organisations who are now trying to sell climate data, because there's a huge demand for it, especially when you come to mention, you know, the likes of precision. People want high resolution, meter resolution, minute in temporal dimensions resolution, etc., etc. And people say, oh, we can do this. Now, we know the science doesn't quite support that type of approach using the models that have been developed, especially those excellent models that have been developed by the Met Office. So I think that regulation is it's not, maybe not regulation, but some guidance or quality standards are needed on this. I'm not sure how that can be best done, but there's certainly a role there, because that would certainly help with the user community. As you mentioned, you know, I've worked for big organisations. I've met people in those organisations who will just grab what they can and buy what they can if it seems to meet their needs in that time-dependent manner and that time-bound manner as well. So what are your thoughts on how best that the scientific community can push that forward? Because I think it should be science-led.
It's a really interesting observation and question, David. I am curious to know whether it should be science-led, or whether actually there is a role across the broader community. I think certainly there's a responsibility by scientists that they shouldn't be selling something which isn't robust. However, in terms of what that regulation or control looks like, my feeling is, and certainly speaking to the purveyors during this particular project, is that it needs to be a joint effort, that there needs to be, say, through the regulatory authorities, through organizations, through DEFRA, but also at the local scale, they actually, what is it that they need, and how do they need it, and what would be acceptable, but also how do you go about implementing it? So issues to do with professionalization came up. What is it? Do we offer some kind of professional standard above and beyond what we have already in terms of ISO provision? And if we do, how does that get regulated? So there was a lot of, whilst not directly referred to, as kind of ethical and moral observations that were raised during the conversations. But yeah, I certainly believe, I mean, you're right insofar as the science community has a strong role, but also in terms of how then the science is received and then processed, such as through the purveyor community, there's a need that they then need to better self-organize and make sure that they provide a more robust service.
This isn't just confined to the UK. So I know a fellow scientist of ours, Andy Pittman in Australia, has picked this up and tried to run this where he's found organisations that haven't maybe been totally honest with what they're trying to do, and try to hold them to account. So I think there's a need here. I think my view is the standards need to be set by the scientific, the climate science community, i.e. what can be done. Hopefully within the next, in the AR7 of the IPCC, it has been raised that this should come up in maybe the cities report about whether they can address what is suitable in terms of downscale data, because again, cities are the area where people want their meter resolution and minute resolution data. So there is a big issue here. So I've just got sense from you, right? Okay. Yeah, the UK, Thomas Bromley says the UK Climate Resilience Programme tries to look at this. I think that was the case where I picked up on this. Is it chartered organisations, government bodies, like the Met Office? I personally think it should be just the Met Office, because they fulfill two roles here. But the Met Office's viewpoint and scientific credibility, is paramount in this. But if it's chartered organisations, then it becomes too disjointed, because every chartered organisation will have a different perspective on this. So there is there's an issue here. I think somehow within the scientific community it should be pushed forward. Right then, I will have to call that to an end now. So I have the final say on that. We have one more slide to go, and I'd just like to thank you again, Peter and Susanne, for your contributions, and also just pushing it back out. If anyone out there would like to give a webinar, has anything to say at all, or even just not just about what you're doing, but what you'd like to see, or any thoughts, in short presentations, please do get in touch with the UKCP team. So I think we've got one final slide announcing the next webinar. For that. Next webinar, 24th of July, Keith Jones from the National Trust, blending climate data with the neurological approach for climate adaptation approaches in the National Trust. This talk will require no deep technical knowledge, so it's perfect for me. And only general knowledge of someone interested in climate projections will be assumed. So it doesn't go into neurological network and deep dives into that. I just point out the 24th of July is is quite an important date, because the 25th of July is my birthday. So anyway, there you go. So look, everyone, thank you very much for taking part. Have a good rest of the day and weekend, a nice hot weekend for many parts of the country. So take it easy and take care. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.